Hazard Assessment and Control. This webinar provides employers, supervisors, and workers with information about hazard assessments and controls for their workplaces. Hazard assessments and controls help build a healthy and safe workplace. They are at the core of every organization's occupational health and safety program. It's the responsibility of the employer to make sure workplace hazards are identified and eliminated or controlled so workers stay healthy and safe on the job. If you have questions about occupational health and safety, OHS, call the Alberta OHS Contact Center at 1-866-415-8690. If you are in Edmonton or the surrounding area, call 780-415-8690. If you have questions about this webinar, email lbr.ohsfeedback@gov.ab.ca. After you've watched this webinar, please take a moment to fill out a short survey and give us your feedback. The link to the survey is on the YouTube page below the subscribe button. Before we begin, we have a disclaimer and copyright notice that we need to bring to your attention. We've done our best to ensure that the information in this webinar is accurate and up to date. However, if there is any discrepancy between this webinar and OHS legislation, the legislation is correct. I'll give you a few moments to read the copyright notice. This webinar is a complement to Hazard Assessment and Control, a handbook for Alberta employers and workers. This Government of Alberta publication is a free, downloadable resource that goes deeper into the topics we cover here. It also has templates and sample forms you can use in your own hazard assessment process. You can find the handbook and the templates on the Alberta OHS Resource Portal. Once you're in the portal, you'll find the handbook under Popular Resources or by typing its ID number, BP018, into the search box in the upper right-hand corner. Today we'll discuss why you would do a hazard assessment and the types of hazard assessments. And then we'll go into greater detail about the formal hazard assessment process, including who should participate, when hazard assessments need to be done, and how to do one. Why do a hazard assessment? As defined in the Alberta Occupational Health and Safety Act, a hazard is a situation, condition, or thing that may be dangerous to health and safety. No matter the size or type of business, there are hazards that may be dangerous to the health and safety of workers or others in the vicinity. Hazard assessments and controls are at the core of any health and safety program. The hazard assessment and control process provides a consistent approach for employers and workers to identify and control hazards in the workplace. This can help build safe and healthy workplaces. Employers have a legal responsibility to make sure workplace hazards are identified and eliminated or controlled so workers can stay healthy and safe on the job. Hazard assessments identify hazards so they can be eliminated or controlled before someone gets hurt, but there are also a number of other potential benefits. By inspiring improvements in day-to-day operations such as maintenance, work procedures, training, or regular housekeeping, workers can see how doing simple things like mopping up spills or picking up debris is more important than they might have thought. They become more proactive. When employers show workers they are important and valued, it demonstrates employer commitment. Feeling valued can inspire participation and ownership of workplace health and safety. It's important that everyone focuses attention on workplace health and safety. Hazard assessments point to specific areas in need of improvement. They get people thinking and talking about health and safety. Hazard assessments can also result in more consistent, efficient, and effective workplaces. One can expect that lowering the risk of a health and safety incident also lowers the number of productive hours lost to worker illness and/or injury. The hazard assessment process can help lower certain operating costs. For instance, fewer incidents means fewer claims filed with the Workers' Compensation Board. Fewer insurance claims means lower annual premiums. Types of hazard assessment. When Alberta's legislation refers to hazard assessments, it's referring to something called a formal hazard assessment. A formal hazard assessment takes a close look at the overall operations of an organization to identify hazards and develop, implement, and monitor related controls. Worker jobs or types of work are broken down into separate tasks. Formal hazard assessments are detailed, can involve many people, including the Health and Safety Committee or Health and Safety Representative, and they require time to complete. Some workplaces also do something called a site-specific hazard assessment, also known as a field-level hazard assessment. Site-specific hazard assessments are used to address hazards that show up because of changing circumstances at the work site. They check for hazards before work starts at a site and at a site where conditions change or when non-routine work is added. Site-specific hazard assessments also check to confirm that existing controls are in place. Any hazards identified must be eliminated or controlled right away before work begins or continues. To learn more about site-specific hazard assessments, see the Hazard Assessment and Control Handbook referenced at the beginning of this webinar. The formal hazard assessment. Who should participate in a hazard assessment? A team approach is necessary when you carry out hazard assessments. Different people have different ways of seeing things. Workers are the people doing the work and are in the best position to provide insight. You must involve affected workers. Anyone who is conducting the hazard assessment must receive training so they know how to recognize, evaluate, and control hazards. They should also understand the job tasks they will be evaluating and the experience or skill level of those doing the work. If you have a health and safety committee or representative, be sure to get them involved. They represent an important part of the internal responsibility system, where everyone in the workplace works as a team to ensure a healthy and safe environment. When to do a formal hazard assessment. Employers are required to perform a hazard assessment before work begins by assessing a work site and identifying existing and potential hazards. Employers also need to do a hazard assessment prior to the construction of a new work site. Additional hazard assessments are required when an organization's operations expand or if changes are made to the way work is performed. Examples include adding new equipment, processes, or tasks, or making alterations or additions to a work site. Even when nothing has changed, hazard assessments must be reviewed periodically to prevent the development of unsafe and unhealthy working conditions. You must also record the date on each hazard assessment. This shows how current it is and may help determine whether or not the document needs to be updated. There are 8 steps in completing a formal hazard assessment. The size and complexity of the business operations will influence how a hazard assessment is done. Use an orderly approach to help identify any real and potential hazards. While it may seem complicated, taking each step one at a time can help the hazard assessment go smoothly. Be sure everyone involved understands the goals and is familiar with the work processes that will be assessed. Step 1. Begin by figuring out what people do in the organization. Start by taking an inventory of all the jobs or work types within the organization. You might develop or reference a list of positions or work types. For example, at a supermarket, positions may include deli counter staff, bakers, grocery clerks, buyers, and inventory managers. Step 2. List all tasks or activities for each job. From your inventory of all the jobs or work types in the organization, compile a list of related tasks for each. Talk to the workers and spend time watching them work. Record the tasks or activities they do. For example, a grocery clerk is responsible for tasks such as scanning groceries, bagging groceries, stocking shelves, and processing payments. Step 3. Identify any health and safety hazards related to each work task and activity. Health hazards are anything that could harm someone's health, either immediately or over time. Examples include loud noises, repetitive movements, sun exposure, and chemical exposure. The effects of health hazards are not always immediate. They can take years to appear, for example, hearing loss due to noise exposure. For this reason, health hazards themselves are often overlooked in the hazard assessment process. A safety hazard is anything that could cause injury or damage, for example, falling objects, slippery surfaces, sharp equipment, or icy roads. An injury caused by a safety hazard is usually immediate, for instance, a broken bone or a cut, and tends to get our attention in a hurry. When someone falls and breaks their back, for example, everyone takes note. Workplace hazards can also be grouped into 4 categories. Physical hazards, for example, slippery surfaces, lifting heavy loads, or extreme temperatures. Chemical hazards, for example, cleaning products, hazardous merchandise like diesel fuel, or gases like carbon monoxide. Biological hazards, for example, animal waste, bodily fluids, or sewage, and psychosocial hazards, for example, harassment, shift work, or violence. Note that more than one category of hazard may be present with each task. When thinking about workplace hazards and how to eliminate or control them, also consider these 4 factors that contribute to how hazards impact a workplace and its workers. The people factor. For example, are they well trained and competent in performing their work? What motivates them, speed or quality? The equipment factor. Is the equipment or are the tools appropriate for the task? Is the equipment properly maintained? The materials factor. What materials are being used? Are they being handled, stored, and disposed of properly? And the environment factor. Where is your work site? An office? A vehicle? Outdoors? Step 4. Find ways to eliminate or control the hazards. Eliminate hazards wherever you can. If you can't eliminate a hazard, it must be controlled. Your hazard assessment may reveal a lot of hazards. It may not be realistic to address them all immediately. Prioritize the hazards you've identified and address those that pose the greatest risk right away. But make sure you have interim controls in place if any hazards have to wait for more permanent solutions. Remember, all identified hazards must be addressed. There's a hierarchy that must be followed when controlling a hazard. The first choice is engineering controls. These control a hazard at the source. Next to eliminating a hazard, engineering controls are the most effective means of preventing illness or injury to workers. Depending on the workplace and processes, examples might include ventilation systems or physical barriers, such as plexiglass. The second choice is administrative controls. These change the way people work. They should be used when elimination isn't an option and engineering controls aren't feasible. Examples include conducting a site-specific hazard assessment, providing worker training, limiting exposure time by rotating jobs, and developing safe work practices and procedures. The third choice is personal protective equipment, or PPE, which controls the hazard at the worker. PPE can only be effective if used properly. Because of this, employers must provide thorough and proper training on its use, care, and limitations. PPE examples can include gloves, eye protection, face masks, or reflective clothing. The use of PPE must be recorded in your hazard assessment and control record, along with the organization's process for training and monitoring its use. Employers may need a mix of engineering and administrative controls as well as PPE to protect workers. Step 5. Implement the selected controls. Once you've identified the hazards and selected the best way to eliminate or control them, you need to follow through with action. Have a plan to implement the identified controls and to confirm they're effective. Again, be prepared to introduce temporary controls when more permanent solutions will take time to implement. For example, you'll want to provide workers with hearing protection, a form of PPE, until a sound barrier, an engineering control, can be put in place to control a noise hazard. Step 6. Communicate the hazards and follow the controls. Workers have to know the hazards of their jobs and what to do to stay healthy and safe in light of those hazards. Make sure all affected workers are aware of and understand the hazards and follow or use the controls in place. The methods used to communicate the information to workers will depend on your organization. Some effective methods may include worker orientation or training sessions, worker mentorship programs, talking about the hazards and the controls during safety meetings, using regular internal communications channels such as your health and safety committee or representative, newsletters, or intranet forums. Employers are required to prepare a report with the results from hazard assessments that includes what is being done to eliminate or control the hazard identified. The report must be in writing and readily available for reference at the worksite. Step 7. Monitor the effectiveness of controls. When we introduce controls, we might end up introducing new workplace hazards. For example, the installation of an engineered sound barrier might have a negative effect on airflow, or when using eye protection, it might fog up, resulting in impaired vision. By regularly monitoring and evaluating the controls, confirming workers are following correct procedures, and making sure equipment is appropriate and in good working condition, we can anticipate problems before the health and safety of workers is negatively affected. Step 8. Review and revise hazard assessments. The workplace is always changing. To keep workers healthy and safe, employers are required to review an existing hazard assessment and make revision as necessary. This could include when a new task, work process, or equipment is introduced, or when there is a significant change to the worksite. Even when nothing's changed, hazard assessments must be reviewed periodically to prevent the development of unsafe and unhealthy working conditions. And don't forget, put a date on your hazard assessments. It's a legal requirement, but it also helps with record management at your end. You'll want to retain up-to-date hazard assessments for your records. You can find customizable templates on the OHS resource portal. Just search BP 018 TMP. Sample forms are also provided in the Hazard Assessment and Control Handbook for your reference. Thank you for viewing this webinar. If you have any questions about hazard assessment and control, call the OHS Contact Center at 1-866 780-415-8690. In Edmonton and the surrounding area, call 780-415-8690. To help us improve our webinars, please fill out a short survey and give us your feedback. The link to the survey is on the YouTube page below the subscribe button.